I'm Ken Rockwell. I've had my Nikon Z9 about 4 months now, and I realize that it is indeed the world's best sports and action camera because it shoots extremely well at 120 frames per second with full autofocus and full auto exposure tracking, something no other camera does, at least as of the writing of this review. Many other cameras will run that fast, but they lock their exposure or lock their autofocus, which means you can't really use them for something that's moving. And if it's not moving, then why in the world would you shoot at 120 frames per second? Some people are afraid that it only shoots at 11 megapixels at this rate, but so what? 11 megapixels is more than enough for anything. I have sold McDonald's 2 megapixel images, and they use them on billboards. So don't come to me saying, oh, it's not enough. No, it's something that scares people who don't shoot every day for a living because they think they really need 40 or 50 or 80 or 175 megapixels. No, 11 megapixels is more than enough for anything. In fact, did you know, even if you're watching this 4K video on a real 4K TV, your 4K TV only has 8 megapixels. So 11 megapixels is more than enough for anything. And if you really want all 45 megapixels, the Z9 shoots that at 30 frames per second all day long. Well, actually not. It'll do about a 4-second burst at either of these rates, but that's okay because anything we're going to shoot at that rate, you don't need to shoot for more than 4 seconds. And if you do, make it a video. For actual sports and action, I have had no problems whatsoever with this. However, at the 120 and 30 frame per second rates, there are some restrictions, and I'll cover those probably in a separate video. Or honestly, I have this all written down at my written review with sample image files and everything in more detail than you could ever possibly want to know at kenrockwell.com. And the link to the specific review, as well as a user's guide, and how to get 30 and 120 frames per second, and everything else is all up at kenrockwell.com and in the description with a link. If you're wondering about this camera and you already have a Nikon mirrorless, well, to be honest, this is newer, better, tougher, smarter, and faster, and completely different from any of the Z7 Mark IIs or ZFC or Z50 or Z6 or Z6 Mark II. It's a completely new animal. One of the things it does differently, and actually many of the things it does differently, are all related to the fact that it has more controls. It has more hard controls. Something I like is it has 3 FN buttons. And you know, Nikon did it right because look at this. They all fall right under my fingers. Something they did wrong is it works great for horizontal shooting, but as soon as I rotate the vertical, it's great because I have a full complement of vertical controls here. Everything falls where it should. I love that. That's critical. And also critical is that this is an integrated vertical grip. It's not a grip that's simply threaded on. This is one monoblock of construction. So this is as solid ingot of aluminum alloy. The problem is when I go to vertical, I have this third button, which is still FN3, but I don't have the other 2 buttons. Nikon got cheap and did not include all 3 buttons here. They should have had an orientation sensor to make this button be FN1, so this finger always gets FN1 regardless of which way you hold it. That's a slight defect, but too bad. There's nothing else like this otherwise. If you own Nikon, to be honest, there's no reason not to get this. If you don't mind the expense, which if you shoot every day as I do, that's not a big deal. And if you don't mind the weight, it actually feels good. This is a good feeling camera. It's certainly smaller than any of the full frame professional DSLRs, and it weighs a little less than some of them, but it's a nice solid camera. It feels like river rock covered with grippy rubber. It's nice and smooth the way Nikon has almost always felt. It's designed properly, so it feels good. You can just grab and go with this, and I don't mind carrying this around all day, every day. So if you shoot sports in action, this is the camera to get. There's nothing else like it. If you're shooting nature landscapes, be honest, the Z7 Mark II will do the same thing. Just, it doesn't look as nice doing it. It doesn't feel as good in your hand, but it does cost less and it does way less. The menu system of Nikon has always been excellent, and it goes even better now. For instance, you'll notice here if you have one thing that's an on-off control, some cameras like Sony's, for crying out loud, they'll make you select this and then select up and down to select off or on. They make you hit return. But no, watch this with Nikon. All you got to do is just press the OK button and the item goes from on to off. If you have multiple selections, like for vibration reduction, you've got 2 modes. But if it's simply a toggle, like distortion control, on, off, boof, 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 it's a beautiful thing. Throughout most of the menus, it's just smarter and there's more stuff you can set. For instance, in playback, this dial here, I can set to be any of like 10 or 50 or 100 or however many shots I want to go forward or back, which makes it very easy to select among photos. Another important thing is even as I make this video at the end of June in 2022, this camera came out last year. I ordered it last year. I got mine in February because I ordered it the minute it came out. You still can't get them in stock. That's okay. The way you get it is you order it. And I have links on where I ordered mine in my description. You order it and you be patient. You only pay $5,500 and it'll show up whenever it shows up and you're good to go. And as of the writing of this review in June of 2022, people are honestly paying $7,000 a piece for used ones of these because this camera is that popular. So that's really all I need to tell you. The key is order it, try it out, and if you hate it, you can send it back. Or you can simply resell it on eBay right now for about $1,500 or $1,000 profit, and you're good to go. So I don't even know why you'd want to watch this review, but hey, I'll tell you anyway. What's new about this camera? It's Nikon's first integrated monoblock mirrorless camera. In other words, this is all one solid block of camera. It's not a little external grip that's screwed on. New is 120 frames per second, which is a world's first for tracking autofocus and tracking exposure. It also does 30 frames per second at a full 45 megapixels, but at 30 and 120, many of the options and settings are fixed. For instance, it only shoots at JPEG normal, which, if you're shooting that fast, people may not realize you're shooting so many files so quickly. Every time you press the button, you may be shooting gigabytes of images, so you really don't want to be shooting RAW. It's got a 1,000-shot RAW buffer at 20 frames per second. At 20 frames per second and below, you have complete control over all the file sizes and everything else. It's just at 30 or 120, those are special modes. Another beautiful thing is it's got the best finder ever. It's got the brightest finder I've ever used, and it doesn't wash out. I love my Canon EOS R3, which also has a beautiful bright finder. The problem is when you're out in daylight, it gets super bright, and it starts to wash itself out, so the highlights look a little bit dull, which means when you're shooting, that's kind of bad because you can't really judge if you've got an overexposed shot or what's going on when you're shooting it in daylight, and that's a significant crippling. With this Nikon, it gets really, really bright, and it also stays sharp and detailed so you can tell how your exposure is. And that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And to be honest, I've been shooting since I was a very little kid. I've been shooting for over 50 years, so I'm sensitive to this. You know what really matters in a camera? With digital cameras, it's all going to make the same images regardless of which Nikon you have. You give me a Nikon ZFC, and except for the frame rates, I'll take the same pictures as I take with the Z9. It's going to look the same colors, same sharpness and everything in actual use. What really varies is how much fun it is to use. Is it enjoyable to look through the finder? Do you have buttons placed where your fingers go? Another wonderful thing about this camera, I'm sure that there have been others, but it's the first camera I can remember, actually has the menu button and the playback button right under my thumb on the correct or right-hand side of the camera. Every other camera puts the menu button over here or the playback button over here, so I'm always having to use two hands to shoot. No, that is huge for me, is the fact that I can shoot this and everything I need to do is right here. I was complaining for a while that the exposure mode button is on the left. However, I programmed this red button. I don't use this camera for video. I use this red button to choose my exposure mode. So if I have it on, I change my exposure mode by holding that red button. Now, the nice thing is, this camera has now done away with the mechanical shutter. It no longer needs a mechanical shutter because the electronic shutter does everything you could want it to do, high flash sync speeds and all that sort of stuff. But you also do have a mechanical shutter. It's not for exposure, but you turn the camera off, it's got a dust protective shutter. And in the menu, God bless Nikon, you can set it to either have this thing closed or not have this thing closed and the camera's off. There's only one curtain though. It's just a dust protector and a finger protector. It's not for exposure. And that's good. Mechanical shutters were only for the days of film when you really needed a mechanical shutter to make your exposure. Today with electronics, it's obsolete. It has more programmable buttons than any other Nikon that I know of, especially these 3 function buttons, which are great for horizontal shooting. What also is new is this top display. It's an OLED or organic light-emitting diode on the Z7 and Z6, which work great anywhere from starlight up to almost full sunlight, but in full sunlight, they get a little bit not bright enough and they're hard to see. This is a black and white LCD, liquid crystal display, which just like a wristwatch from the 1980s, means you can read this in any light. In full sunlight, it looks like this. It's bright and sharp and contrasty, and there's an illuminator, just like our other Nikons, that does this. What is also new is a focus mode button. This is a dedicated focus mode button. It does nothing but focus mode. And of course, firmware can change over time, but all this does is focus mode. Well, I never use this button, and that's sad because I need to shoot with one hand because I'm doing usually something else with my other hand. And so I never use this, but that's okay because I programmed my focus mode button to be one of these function buttons. So again, it's a wasted button for me, but it is new. And again, everybody's different. Maybe you like this, maybe use this, maybe not. I hate fake shutter sounds, but guess what? For the first time ever, the fake shutter sound on this camera is awesome. The fake shutter sound is brilliant because at slow speeds, it actually clicks once to open and clicks a second time to close. It's very quiet and soft when you set it to the soft level, so nobody else is going to hear it except for you. And because The shutter sounds different depending on the shutter speed. And for we old timers who used to be able to hear if a camera's actually going in an eighth of a second or 15th or 30th or quarter or 1 second, we can hear that. That is one way we can just hear and confirm that the shutter's doing what we think it should do. In other words, if we had the camera set to manual and it's shooting at a thousandth of a second and we're shooting indoors at night and hand-holding what we thought should be around a 30th or an eighth, and again, with experience, you just get used to this. That's great because it's one more fail-safe. I love that. There's a built-in voice recorder. There's a microphone built in, which you'll notice if you're looking with your eye here, your mouth goes right here, so you can whisper into this if you're shooting in a group. And what you use in news reporting, you'll oftentimes, or sports reporting, you'll mention what's going on. And it's nice that you can whisper into it because if you're photographing, say, a group in a corporate boardroom, you can whisper what's going on or who's in the picture or what just happened, and that way you or your editor can figure out what that picture is, which is very important in reporting. And the way you make it work is you just hold in this. You can set this in a menu, do what you want, but I press it so I just keep this held in. It records what I want it to do, and I believe if I tap this on playback, it'll play it back. That is critical for a pro camera. It has a 1/32,000th maximum shutter speed, care of the electronic shutter. It'll make timed manual exposures as long as 15 minutes if you enable that in the menu. It also has time and bulb options, so God bless Nikon, it does it all. It also has nearly no rolling shutter distortion. Everything stays as straight as any shutter ever has, so that's a beautiful thing. Thank goodness they fixed the old problem where in autofocus continuous mode, the red color was used to show you were in focus. No, to me, red means stop. You can set now to green. Don't get me started about 8K. First of all, you can't even get an 8K monitor. And even if you have a 4K monitor, which I do, if you have a 55-inch 4K monitor and you're about 2 feet away from it, you have to be 2 feet away from it to see 4K. If you had 8K, you need to be about a foot away from a 55-inch monitor. Otherwise, it looks the same. But anyway, this will shoot 8K for 2 hours straight. Another nifty thing, which I can't really show you here because it's very dark, is for astronomy, surveillance, and sniper use. You can set this LCD screen as well as the finder to be a very dim red. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, the dim red lets you see what you're doing, but you don't lose your night vision if you're doing astronomy. And if you're a sniper or doing surveillance, one of the things you never want to do is give away your position, which if you have this bright camera, it lights up your face, and then that could be a life or death situation. Nice thing is it'll stay a dim red and be much less likely to give you away if you hit it by accident. It also has a starlight view option, which seems a bit silly. Starlight view, which again, I can't really show you here. Starlight view just makes the shadows lighter in the finder or the rear LCD. In other words, it lets you see into the shadows better when you're shooting at night. There's a weird new finder display size option that lets you reduce the size of the live view image to let the Z9 be held further away from your eye so you don't have vignetting so you can still see the full image. You have some selectable finder modes. You select how the camera shows you that it's just clicked, i.e. is it a rectangle around the frame or black frames or right frames or whatever, you control that. You now have a level display option that lets you have bars on the sides and bottom of the image as well as the usual. You can navigate menu with the rear thumb nubbin and the 4-way controller as well as the dials as well as the touchscreen. There's a new menu option, which is really useful for those of you who need it, which is called delete from both cards. I always shoot with the second card being my backup, and so it's good because when I press the delete key, if I get too happy with this and start deleting stuff I didn't really want to delete, it always stays on my second backup card. So I go to my backup card and pull a deleted image off. If for some reason you really want to delete from both cards each time you press that button, that is an option. A new option is IPTC embedding. So if you want to put your data in there, the camera can do that for you. You don't have to do it after the fact. What's new is this completely cockamamie touchscreen. Now, it's got this bizarre contraption, which I think is the right word, this contraption here, which lets you go up this far, down that far. You can go that far to the side, which is not much, or you can kind of go all the way this way. I hate this thing. I would much rather just have a larger screen, and guess what? You see how the screen isn't even as big as you think it is because it's got this black area around it? So the screen is actually pretty small on the back of the camera. There's enough room that if you took away this contraption, this mechanism, you could make the screen grow from here all the way to fill all this out, which is still smaller than my iPhone. But I don't know about you, but with my iPhone, I have no problem holding it at arm's length and seeing exactly what's in my frame better than trying to peer at this thing at arm's length just because it rotates. But that's just me. It's got a security slot. If you're using this in a prison or in a school, good luck with that. It's rated for operation down to 10 degrees below 0 Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, good luck with that. My experience has been all these cameras usually work better than rated, and the biggest problem is keeping the batteries warm enough so they still make power. And so something we've done for decades back with regular 35mm cameras is you keep a second set of batteries in your pocket so they're warm, and you swap them out as necessary. What's good? As I mentioned, the finder is awesome. Another thing is the finder view really is live. If you work in anywhere from moderate light, like shade outdoors, down to indoors, honestly, you wiggle your finger, you look through the finder, the darn thing is completely live. There's no question about that. That is really neat. In full sunlight, it starts to strobe a little bit. In other words, there's a little bit shorter exposure or capture time from the sensor to when they display it. So it's still up to date, but instead of seeing a continuous, well, of course, you're seeing this at my video here. Instead of seeing a continuous smear as it is in real life, as it usually looks through the finder, it'll start to strobe a little bit, but it is quite live. I don't know how they do it. They talk about like dual data paths, which is a bunch of marketing baloney. The key is it really works well. What also was nice is either of the two card slots, I prefer SD cards, but they didn't ask me. Each one either takes XQD cards or it takes CF Express Type B. Your choice, either two slots, it's a beautiful thing. Another nice thing is the displays rotate during vertical shooting. All this data rotates, however, the menus don't. So it's still, it's getting better. Another thing that's nice is most of you guys won't notice it, but it doesn't have any significant vertical interline transfer smear, which is a bunch of technical gobbledygook. That means when you take a picture of the sun at a large aperture, you get a vertical smear, which is a matter of how the information is read from the sensor. I can shoot at f2 pointing right at the sun, which means if I have something in the foreground and the sun is shining around behind something, I don't get that vertical smear. That's good design. It's something they don't talk about, but it is well thought out. It's got great power control. It's got a big battery, so it lasts. And honestly, I leave this thing turned on all day long. And the trick is I tap this as I'm bringing it to my eye. I don't bring it to my eye and then tap it. I tap it as I bring it to my eye. It's always awake. The battery's always ready to go. It always turns off as it needs to, so that's good. It's got in-camera sensor shift stabilization, but you probably knew that. It has some illuminated buttons. Here's the problem. Personally, every telephone I've owned since the 1980s has had everything illuminated so I can use it in the pitch black. No big deal. Why is it that Japanese camera makers can't figure out how to illuminate all my buttons? I don't know. Ask them. But as you can see here, some of the buttons illuminate, some of them don't, which means some of them you're just not going to be able to read, and too bad. So sad. What's bad? Well, maybe newer firmware will make this happen, and it's encouraging if people have a positive attitude, thinking, oh, Nikon is going to make this work in the next version of firmware. But guess what? They usually don't. Things like autofocus in the Z6, Z7 was always crappy. Honestly, Z7 Mark II, I didn't think that much more of. So they could fix it in firmware, but why are they going to spend a lot of time doing things backwards for cameras they already introduced as opposed to work on the new cameras? I don't know. Ask them. I have not been able to figure out a modern way so when I have my eye to the viewfinder that I can scroll around and move my autofocus areas if I have to select them manually. I still have to do it like it's the 1970s with this four-way clicker here, a four-way clicker there. There's no equivalent to a mouse. Canon is far superior. On their EOS R3, they have a button right here that actually has a fingerprint sensor, which works like a backwards optical mouse. It actually reads your thumbprint, and as you move your thumb, it either scrolls around your playback image or moves your autofocus sensors directly and exactly in response live to however you move your thumb. That is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. On this Nikon, I haven't even been able to figure out how to set it so I can just move my finger around the right half of the screen so that while I have my eye here, I can select autofocus areas like this. Sad but true. Maybe there's a way to do it, but I haven't figured it out. And really, compared to shooting my Canons that have this brilliant touch sensor on it, it makes the Nikons feel like they're from the 1970s. And by 1970s, I mean, if you remember computers from back then, before we had mice, you had to click up, down, left, right, just to move the cursor around the screen. There was no mouse or touch screen to move it around. And that's, unfortunately, is where this camera still is. What's sad is, again, is it the 1970s or what here? The file numbers do have 3 programmable letters at the beginning, good, but then there's an underscore, which you can't make anything else other than underscores. You only have 3 letters instead of 4 letters. But even worse, the shot counter can only make 10,000 shots before the file names repeats. Guess what? That doesn't sound like much, and it didn't used to be much. When you're firing away at 120 frames per second, the first time I took this camera out to go shoot some sports, I had this problem. It's now, of course, making its own multiple folders to store all this, but then when I brought it into my computer for me to sort these things, I'm like, hey, hold on here. Now I have multiple files with the same name in the same, well, effective folder, the same job, or even the same just heat on a race. That's bad. Even Leica's Pokey M9 of 2009 used 7 digits in their file names to prevent duplicate file names, although that camera could barely shoot at like 1 frame a second. So Nikon needs to fix that, or at least I think they do. You know, we're all different. And again, unlike most things in life, there's not that many cameras to choose from. So for sports and action where I really need 120 frames per second, there's nothing else like the Z9. Another bad thing is, it still seems that now when I use my second card for backup, When the backup fills or the first card fills, the whole thing shuts down and gives me a warning saying the card's filled up. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. In other words, if the first one that dies kills everything, why do I have a backup? Well, as I said, so I can recover things that I've deleted. However, I really wish it would just keep on shooting. Give me a notice saying, oh, by the way, Ken, one of your cards is full, but not stop me dead in the water. And again, this stuff is all, as the years go on, it may or may not be rectified. Who knows? Also, there's no universal preset, U1, U2, U3. I really like that and need that. Why? Well, I don't just shoot one thing for the rest of my life. I go from shooting nature and landscapes, then I'm shooting sports, then I'm shooting portraits, then I'm back to shooting nature and landscapes. Maybe I'm shooting nature and landscapes, and somebody says, hey, Ken, take my picture. I need to shoot at an instant, get everything reset. Yes, it still has the stupid settings banks, which means if I set two different things in two different menus, I can recall those, but those only recall 2/3 of the things that they maybe could recall, like frame rates and so forth, and autofocus modes. So big thumbs down for Nikon on that. In other words, if all you do is shoot news and sports, that's great. But if also you shoot nature and landscapes, or, oh, now I'm on a tripod, so now I want to set the self-timer, and I want to force the lens to f8, and I want to turn off the image stabilization, and I want to force ISO 64 for the sharpest possible image and just let the exposure go as long as it needs to. All those different settings, if I have all the time in the world, which I don't, you can hear how fast I talk. If I'm talking too fast, find the gear icon and however you play this video, and you can hit playback speed and slow me down to 075 or 05x, and then you'll be able to understand what I'm talking about. If I had all the time in the world, I could set all those things manually, but then I need a pilot's checklist to make sure that I set all the things I need to set so that, again, I'm not out shooting something else, shooting sports at ISO 64 in the dark, and it all comes out blurry. So I really prefer Canon, where they have C1, C2, C3 that memorize and recall everything. But that's just for that one particular feature. Canon's camera doesn't run at 120 frames per second yet. What's bizarre is there's no 4:5 image crop mode. I use that a lot, especially for vertical. The 3:2 standard is really way too tall for just about anything, especially shot vertically. So I always set my dial. Well, I do. I set my preset. Oh, I can't get it now because it's, again, I'm holding it vertically. In any case, I usually set my second one here to choose that. What you don't see is I'm pressing my second FN button, but it doesn't have a 4:5 crop. Again, it could be firmware, but don't ever buy things in the hope that it's going to magically appear. Another bad thing, production was dumped. It's dumped offshore. Yours could be different as time goes on. This one was dumped to Thailand. I love Thailand, but if I'm buying a Japanese branded camera like Nikon, I want it made in Japan. I don't want to pay top dollar for something offshored someplace else. But that's just me. It has only 1/200th of a second flash sync, which is not that bad, but I mean, come on. The world has been stuck at about a 250th of a second flash sync for focal plane shutters since about, I don't know, the 1990s. I wish it was faster. And the reason I wish it was faster, again, I have a whole other article on this, but it lets you shoot and save flash power when you're shooting with fill flash in daylight, which is a lot of what I do. I haven't heard anybody else complain, but I'll also be honest, I don't read the internet. I don't watch YouTube. I shoot, see what I do, and if I have the time, I write it down for you guys on my website. So I'm sure somebody complains somewhere. The autofocus doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes it can't find focus and it hunts back and forth, meaning it goes in and out and doesn't stop and it can't find the focus. I've had that happen with this camera with several different lenses. I'm on firmware version 2 now, and that's not right. It hasn't happened, so I've missed shots, but I don't think you should do that. What's missing? I mentioned it doesn't have vertical FN buttons for 2 and 3. There's no fast way to delete burst groups or ranges of images. What I like is the EOS R3 from Canon now has a new delete burst option. Simply when you press this trash button, it can delete the entire burst you just took. So if you took a burst that you know has an oops, I didn't get that, it'll delete the whole burst, and it doesn't require you to delete a whole bunch of other stuff. And by doing that, you can come back from a job and get your images sorted out much more quickly. It no longer has a mechanical shutter. Good riddance, except for the dust shield. The 30 and 120 frame per second mode, as I said, work great, but there's many options and settings that are fixed at standard values, and that's actually good. For instance, the Canon EOS R3 runs at very high frame rates, but it almost makes you play a guessing game to figure out what you have to turn off so that it can run at that rate. Nikon's a little different in that you have to get to the 30 frame per second mode as a separate mode, and that mode in turn turns off and optimizes everything but the camera, so it really does run at 30 or 120 per second. The fake shutter sound is always very accurate to what the camera's doing. Even at 30 frames per second, I love these sound effects. It'll be going brrrr. When you go to 120, it doesn't sound any different than 30, and it should, so that when I'm shooting sports, I know what's going on. Oddly, still missing is there's no automatic brightness control for the rear LCD. My iPhones have done this for 10 years now or more. My Canon EOS 5D-SR has an automatic bright control on the rear LCD, which is important because in daylight it's bright enough to see, and indoors it's not blinding me. I don't know why they can't figure this out. Maybe somebody has a patent or something. I don't know. There's no built-in flash, but that's not news. It's not threaded to use a standard cable release, but, come on. It's 2022, and I'll give them credit for that because when I shoot in the dark, I'm using the self-timer, and I'm using everything else, so I really don't need the cable release anymore unless I'm trying to catch something, like maybe if I'm trying to shoot lightning and think I'm that fast, which I'm not. But there is none, which means you have to go buy a cable release if you need one. Very peculiarly, when you're using the time exposure mode, meaning you press the button and come back, an hour later and it just goes up on its own, you still have to use your Apple Watch and time it. It doesn't show you on the top screen what the exposure time is so far. Nikon is really taunting us because the top LCD stays on the whole time during a time exposure and shows some things, but it won't show you the count up time. There's no focus mode lever. A complaint of mine is you have to hold the button, then spin the dial to change focus modes. In olden days, you used to just turn the dial from AFS to AFC to M, and another one to select multiple focus areas, one focus area, group focus area. No, you've got to use a dial and a button. And the reason that takes longer is you now have to take your eye off the subject, stop what you're doing, hold the mode button down, turn the dial, and take your eye off and look at the indicator for AFS or AFM. In the old days, you could do it by feel without taking your thought away from the subject. There's oddly no color histograms. The only histogram you get while you're shooting is black and white, which is useless because when you're shooting in color, there's going to be one color that's going to overload first, and that sets the limitation on what you can do. But the only way to get color histograms that I found so far is in playback. The rear multi-controller doesn't rotate as an additional control. In other words, this doesn't spin around. So what? You've got this. Oddly, I haven't found a way to program the OK button. It used to be just one click, hit OK, and it would enter playback and zoom in on my other digital cameras. The Canon can do that. Big Time Saver hasn't done that. The menu system is so complicated now that there's no find option in it. No other camera does this either. Now that the menus are so huge, it'd be nice to have a find option so I could just get to where I wanted by typing on the touchscreen. On the good side, Nikon's menus are easy enough to figure out that I haven't needed that. Oddly, you can't force the full frame mode when shooting with the DX lens. You used to be able to cheat, and with some lenses like the 35mm f1.8 AFS lens, which was a DX lens, you could shoot it on full frame and get most of the full frame cheating, but no, you can't cheat with this camera. If you have a DX lens on it, there's no way to engage the full frame mode. There's no dedicated ISO dial, no dedicated shutter speed dial, but that's been fairly the case with Nikon. This is an interesting one. The USA version, which is this. Again, I got it from B&H. I'm an American, proudly, and I got my American version camera. It only has menus in English, French, and Spanish. This is probably to prevent gray marketers from cross-shipping cameras between countries, but on the other hand, almost every version probably includes English. But what's odd is this USA version I can't set to work in Japanese or German or any other language other than English, French, or Spanish. Strange but true. Every other camera used to have 100 different languages on it. And that's most of it. To be honest, I could go on for longer, but this has been a long enough review. If you want to see detailed sample images, if you want to see explicit user guides on how to make every trick, tip, and feature on this camera hum, if you want to see high ISO samples, color samples, explicit user guides, everything is all at my website at kenrockwell.com. And again, the links are in the description. And I really appreciate you guys watching. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell and kenrockwell.com here on kenrockwell.tv.